Night settles over Rome the way dust settles over old books. Slowly, quietly, as if the city itself is exhaling after 1,000 years of remembering too much. The lamps along the Tiber flicker like candles in an endless hallway. Tourists drift away, footsteps fading, leaving only the soft murmur of distant fountains and the steady breathing of a city that has learned to keep its oldest truths buried deeper than stone. And somewhere beneath that calm surface, beneath the marble courtyards, beneath the echo of prayers whispered for centuries, there is a door. A door most people will never see. A door guarded not by locks or guards, but by silence. A silence older than Christianity. A silence older than Rome. A silence that knows the names of beings humanity forgot before it learned to write. Tonight, we begin there, at the threshold of a history that does not appear in any sermon, any museum, or any public archive. A history kept deliberately soft-edged, wrapped in allegory, spoken only in careful metaphors by men in robes who understand exactly how fragile belief can be. Somewhere beneath these streets lies the Vatican's quietest inheritance, the memory of the Anunnaki. Not as gods, not as demons, not as myths, but as the oldest presence humanity ever tried to describe, the weight of forgotten knowledge. Walk through St. Peter's Square at night, and you can feel it. The way the air thickens near the obelisk, the way the shadows around the basilica seem to lean inward instead of out. Rome is full of history, but Vatican City is full of memory, and the two are not the same. History is what we are allowed to read. Memory is what is never written down. And the Vatican has always been the greatest collector of memory on earth. It preserved empires, languages, erased gospels, forbidden theologies, astronomical observations, royal bloodline records, and accounts from civilizations whose ruins sleep beneath modern cities. But it also preserved something else, fragments of a story older than religion, fragments that whisper of a time when the sky was more crowded than we imagine, when humanity was not alone on the earth, when visitors walked among early kings and scribes, fragments that hint that the beings the Sumerians called Anunnaki, and the beings the early Hebrews called Elohim, and the beings Christian mystics later called Watchers, may not have been separate stories at all. They may have been attempts, imperfect ones, to describe encounters with the same presence, a presence recorded in clay long before it was rewritten in parchment. Entering the vault of airless rooms. Imagine descending a staircase that coils like a serpent under the Vatican Library. The air grows still. The scent becomes colder, more mineral, as if sunlight hasn't touched it since the Renaissance. The stairs empty into a corridor lined with iron-barred doors. Behind one, manuscripts so old their ink fades when exposed to light. Behind another, letters from missionaries describing statues found beneath desert ruins, statues with eyes too large to belong to men. Behind another, fragments of tablets with symbols older than Akkadian, older than Hebrew, older even than Sumer itself. Scholars call these proto-languages. Linguists call them undeciphered. Archivists call them unpublished. But the men who have held them in their hands know better. Some of these markings are not attempts to write. They are attempts to record. Diagrams, angles, star paths, geometric sequences. Lines that resemble instructions rather than poetry. If legends are to be believed, some tablets are stored in wax-lined containers because the clay itself is so fragile it cannot be touched. Others are sealed not because of fragility, but because of meaning. They describe beings descending from the sky in radiant craft. They describe councils of those who came before, choosing leaders among early humans. They describe a time when knowledge was given, not learned. And the Vatican knows exactly what these tablets say. It is known for centuries. Why silence was easier than truth. The Church never had to destroy dangerous information. It only had to store it where no one could reach. A single locked room is more effective than 1,000 bonfires. Because once something is burned, its absence becomes suspicious. But when something is preserved privately, catalogued under obscure Latin codes, accessible only with written authorization from offices most people don't know exist, then silence becomes natural, comfortable, expected, invisible. And this silence served a purpose: to admit publicly that humanity might have been visited, guided, or shaped by beings who arrived from the sky thousands of years before the Bible was written, would fracture the foundation of doctrine. It would not destroy faith. Faith is stronger than that. But it would destroy exclusivity, the idea that humanity's story begins in one place, written by one hand, revealed in one sequence of divine events. The Anunnaki made that story too crowded, so the Vatican did not deny them. It simply filed them away. Not erased, not forgotten, just contained. The Mesopotamian echo. Long before Christ, before Moses, before the pyramids rose with their silent geometry, the people of ancient Mesopotamia told stories of beings who descended from the sky with knowledge that reshaped the world. They called them Anunnaku, the lords who descended. They taught astronomy, agriculture, law, architecture. They selected kings. They measured the heavens. They carved knowledge into clay. And then, according to the myths, they left. Or perhaps they became silent. The early church encountered these stories through traders, through scholars, through translated tablets brought along caravan routes. Priests noted the similarities with biblical events centuries before archaeologists ever found the ruins of Sumer. The parallels were undeniable. A garden created for early humans, a flood sent by sky beings, a single man chosen to survive, a pantheon discussing humanity's fate, beings descending in fire or radiance, visitors mixing their essence with mortals, kings whose authority came from heaven. These stories were too close to scripture to ignore, and too old to explain away. So the church did what powerful institutions always do when confronted with inconvenient truth. It absorbed what it could, it repainted what it couldn't, and it buried what remained. A whisper through stone. Walk into any cathedral and you'll see familiar shapes. Beings descending on rays of light, figures surrounded by halos that flare like coronas, wheels within wheels, eyes within flames, wings that look more engineered than feathered, golden objects resembling tools instead of symbols. Art historians call them metaphors. The Vatican calls them angels. But ancient Sumer called them something else entirely. And when you look closely at the oldest Christian art created when memories of pagan empires were still fresh, you find details that do not belong to theology. Circular devices held by beings with calm, expressionless eyes, star maps etched behind saints, strange rods or spheres that resemble instruments more than religious emblems. These images aren't inventions, they're inheritances, a visual language passed down through civilizations, repainted again and again until its meaning blurred. The church did not create these motifs, it inherited them, and some historians believe it knew exactly what it was inheriting. The Vatican's quiet dilemma. For centuries, the church has been forced to navigate a problem no institution envies. How do you protect faith while preserving evidence that may contradict its origins? If the Anunnaki were real beings, if early humanity was shaped, guided, or uplifted, if creation was not a single divine act, but a sequence of interventions, then the Bible becomes something different. Not false, but incomplete. A retelling instead of a beginning. A window instead of a foundation. And that is why the Vatican guards what it knows. Not out of malice, not out of greed, but out of fear. Fear that knowledge delivered too quickly shatters the world it tries to explain. Faith can survive mystery, but institutions struggle with it. Chapter 2. The Sky Roads of the First Civilizations. Before Egypt, before Greece, before Rome carved its laws into stone, there was Sumer, a land between rivers where the night sky stretched wider than belief and the first cities rose like constellations fallen to earth. And there, buried beneath thousands of years of dust, archaeologists found something unsettling. Mathematical precision far beyond what early civilizations should possess. Star charts showing planets invisible without modern telescopes. Stories of beings descending from above. Radiant boats of heaven. Kings who ruled for impossibly long spans. Descriptions of tools that sound like machines. Most mainstream scholars will tell you these are metaphors. But metaphors do not last thousands of years unchanged. They shift, they soften, they fragment. These stories did not. And when Jesuit translators in the 1800s first began working on cuneiform tablets, some of their letters, still preserved in restricted Vatican collections, described phrases they hesitated to translate literally. Phrases that hinted at vehicles descending from the sky, instructions given to early astronomers, maps of star systems not visible to the naked eye, descriptions of beings that were not born of woman. The Jesuits were brilliant scholars, but they were also servants of the Church. Their work was filtered before publication. Dangerous translations were adjusted, literal meanings softened. A being descending from the sky became a vision. A craft of fire became a cloud of glory. A council of gods became a heavenly host. And the story held steady, not erased, not denied, just softened until it no longer threatened doctrine. The invisible boundary. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The Vatican does not need to lie. It only needs to omit. Because omission is the gentlest form of control, so subtle that most people never realize anything is missing. But deep in those archives, in air that has been undisturbed for centuries, there is no omission. There is only record. Records of texts older than Genesis, symbols older than Hebrew, memories older than religion, memories of beings humanity once called gods, and later called angels, and now calls myths. The names change, the presence does not, and the Vatican knows this. It has always known this. Before the first Hebrew psalm was sung, before the first pyramid stone was laid, the people of ancient Sumer carved their memories into clay. Not stories, not poetry, memories. The tablets they left behind do not read like myths. They read like records, measured, structured, chronological, technical in ways early civilizations were not supposed to be. When you run your fingers across the ridges of an old cuneiform slab, you feel the trace of a hand that lived 5,000 years ago, pressing truth into wet clay before the sun baked it into permanence. Some tablets speak of harvests, some of trade, some of floodwaters. But a rare handful, the ones never displayed in museums, the ones quietly labeled private collection, the ones that passed through Jesuit translators and never resurfaced, those speak of beings who did not belong to Earth. Beings who arrived when the skies were still unfamiliar. Beings whose faces were described with reverence, not imagination. Beings the Sumerians simply called Anunnaki, the great ones, those who from the heavens came. Not as phantoms, not as metaphors, but as physical presences who walked among early kings. The Vatican has read these tablets. It has studied them for centuries in quiet rooms lit by single lamps, and it understands the same thing ancient scribes understood. These beings were not invented, they were remembered, where memory becomes myth. Civilizations do not invent identical gods unless they are describing the same presence. Across the ancient world, from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the temples of India, the pattern repeats with surgical precision. A powerful being descends from the sky. It teaches agriculture, writing, astronomy. It appoints rulers. It departs. Different names. Same ritual. Same sequence. The Anunnaki of Sumer. The Devas of the Vedic hymns. The Apkallu of Babylon. The Watchers spoken of in early Hebrew traditions. The Shining Ones in early Celtic myths. The Sky Teachers of the Andes. The stories do not diverge. They echo. And the Vatican, with access to texts from every corner of the world, is one of the few institutions capable of seeing the full pattern. It knows that these stories are not isolated inventions. They're fragments of a larger memory, a memory humanity carried before writing existed, a memory that became myth because there was no other language to contain it. Chapter 4. The Flood that Erased the First World. Every civilization has a flood story. Not some, not most, every single one. Cultures separated by oceans tell the same narrative, down to the same structure. A warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel, a deluge that resets the world, a return to order led by beings from above. The Sumerians called their survivor Ziusudra. The Akkadians called him Utnapishtim. The Hebrews called him Noah. Different names, same event. When archaeologists first discovered Sumerian flood tablets, they were stunned, not because they contradicted Genesis, but because they preceded it by thousands of years. And among those early translations were lines Jesuit scholars did not publish. Lines describing councils of sky beings debating the fate of humanity. Lines describing craft rising above the waters as the earth trembled. Lines describing the measuring of rivers from the heavens. These were not theological statements. They were eyewitness records as the ancient world understood them. This is why certain tablets quietly disappeared into private collections. Not destroyed, preserved where only a handful could access them. If the public were shown that the flood story was far older than scripture, if they were shown that angels and gods had descriptions too physical to be allegory, if they were shown that early civilizations described celestial beings in engineering terms, faith would not collapse. But the hierarchy controlling what faith means would, and that is what the Vatican cannot allow. Chapter 5. The Genealogies of Heaven. Walk through the Vatican's archival corridors and you'll notice something strange. Endless shelves dedicated not to theology, but to genealogy. Records of kings, records of priestly lines, records of ancient families traced back through centuries of births, deaths, coronations, and bloodlines. Why would the Church, a spiritual institution, care so intensely about lineage? Because ancestry was once considered divine property. In Sumer, rulers were chosen by the Anunnaki. Their authority was inherited, not earned. Their bloodlines were said to contain a trace of the essence of the sky. When Rome absorbed the ancient world, it did not discard this idea. It renamed it divine right of kings, chosen bloodlines, holy lineage. The terminology changed, the structure did not. And buried within the Vatican's genealogical archives are references avoided by modern historians. Notes in Latin describing certain royal lines as blessed by the stars, descended from watchers, or carrying the mark of the heavens. Never explained, never publicized, but carefully preserved. No one writes such phrases accidentally. There are scholars, silent ones, careful ones, who have suggested that some royal lines were believed to carry remnants of ancient genetic intervention. Not proof, but belief strong enough to be archived. The Vatican does not confirm this. It does not deny it. It simply stores the records and moves on. Silence is the safest answer. The danger of a shared origin. If humanity descended not from a single miraculous act, but from a sequence of guided interventions, if ancient gods were early engineers, if the line between angel and Anunnaki is linguistic, not biological, then the entire structure of divine exclusivity changes. The Vatican knows this. Its theologians debated it privately for centuries. Its scholars saw the parallels. Its archivists collected the evidence. And the conclusion they reached was simple, unavoidable, and terrifying. Humanity may not be as independent as Scripture suggests. This is not an idea a global religious authority can reveal casually. So it was folded into silence. Not erased, preserved, but inaccessible. Chapter 6. The Watchers of the Early Church. The early Christian world was chaotic, a storm of beliefs, visions, and competing interpretations of heaven. During those first centuries, angels were not gentle figures with wings. They were enormous, blinding presences. They had multiple faces, metallic forms, wheels of fire. They descended from the sky. They taught forbidden knowledge. They interacted with humans. Early writings, especially those the Vatican later labeled apocryphal, described these beings with details uncomfortably close to Mesopotamian gods. The Book of Enoch described watchers who descended from the heavens, taught astronomy and metalwork, and took human wives. The resemblance to Anunnaki myths is unmistakable, too unmistakable, which is why the Book of Enoch was removed from the canon. Not because it was false, but because it was too literal. If early Christians believed angels were sky beings who taught humanity, the line between divine messenger and ancient visitor would blur beyond repair. So the Church chose a safer image. Wings, halos, human faces, harps, soft light, symbolic forms. Not because the originals lacked grandeur, but because the originals looked too much like something the Vatican did not want to explain. a truth softened over time. By redefining angels as spiritual metaphors instead of physical beings, the Church softened the connection between biblical beings and ancient visitors. But the older descriptions survived in the margins. Ezekiel's wheels of fire, seraphim with 6 wings and burning bodies, cherubim that resembled hybrid creatures, watchers who descended to teach forbidden arts. These are not gentle images. They are descriptions of encounters. And while the Vatican will never say this explicitly, it curated which stories entered the Bible and which did not. The ones too close to Sumerian memory were quietly set aside. Not destroyed, preserved in locked rooms where scholars read them under strict supervision. Chapter 7. The Councils that Erased the Old Cosmos. Between the 2nd and 5th centuries, Christian councils redrew the map of heaven. Before these councils, the cosmology of the ancient world was vast. Multiple heavens, multiple orders of celestial beings, star-traveling entities, divine councils, composite beings of fire, metal, and light. This was not metaphor. It was the worldview inherited from civilizations far older than Christianity. But a simpler system was easier to control. So the councils sharpened the world into a single clean structure. One heaven, one God, one creation, one cosmic hierarchy. Everything else, every reference to beings who descended, interacted, guided, or intervened, was labeled pagan, mythic, or heretical. Texts were excluded, others were rewritten. The universe was scaled down to a size that fit inside doctrine. And behind every removed text was a silent logic. If humanity had been visited, instructed, or engineered by sky beings, Christianity could not claim exclusive divine authorship of human origin. So the ancient world's memory of celestial visitors became allegory, not through destruction, through redefinition. And the truth survived only in private archives. The Vatican's hidden curators. Most people imagine the Vatican as a monolithic institution, but its archives are managed by specialists, linguists, historians, archivists, monks trained to decipher ancient scripts. Some spend their entire lives studying documents the public never sees. They know what the tablets say. They know how early Christians struggled with writings that blurred angels and sky gods. They know which apocryphal texts were removed because they described intervention too literally. These scholars are not villains. They are protectors of an uncomfortable truth, a truth they cannot fully reveal, a truth they cannot deny, a truth they preserve in silence. The councils that shaped the early church believed they were creating order, carving a clean path from heaven to earth. But in doing so, they also carved away fragments of a much older memory. Memories of visitors whose presence was too immense, too physical, too ancient to fit inside a single doctrine. The early theologians were not blind to the echoes left behind by older civilizations. They saw the stories carved into clay, the visions described by prophets, the strange beings that hovered in the margins of apocryphal texts. And yet they chose simplicity. They chose a universe with fewer doors, a universe that could be held together without allowing too many old voices to speak. But the world beyond those councils did not forget. Across deserts and mountains, in villages that existed before empires rose, stories continued to pass from one generation to another, untouched by canon law. Stories of luminous beings descending from the night sky. Stories of teachers who were not quite mortal, who walked upright but glowed with an inner light. Stories of kings chosen not by human hands but by messengers whose shadows stretched across the earth like wings of metal and fire. The Vatican inherited these stories as much as it inherited scripture, and in time it learned that the seams between faiths were thinner than anyone imagined. Inside the quietest rooms of the archives, beneath dust that has settled like snowfall for generations, there are manuscripts describing visions recorded by monks in the early centuries. These men wrote in languages now nearly forgotten, and their handwriting trembles as if recording something they felt unworthy to describe. They speak of beings who appeared in cloisters during cold nights, radiant forms that filled entire chambers with a soft hum like resonant metal. The monks called them angels because no other word fit. But their descriptions, careful, frightened, awestruck, do not match the gentle images painted centuries later. They describe forms like living sculptures, faces too symmetrical to belong to humans, bodies wrapped in light that shimmered like polished stone. One monk, whose journal is preserved but never displayed, wrote that the being he saw carried the scent of storms. and spoke without breath. He said the voice seemed to come from the air around him, not from any mouth he could see. Another wrote that the visitors entered the room without disturbing the door, and when they drew near, the torches dimmed as if ashamed of their flame. These accounts were never condemned, they were simply stored. Their literal nature made them unsuitable for doctrine, yet too sincere to destroy. And so the Vatican kept them, quietly acknowledging without admitting that something older than Christianity still walked in the shadows of faith. In other parts of the world, missionaries recorded similar encounters. Not spiritual visions, but stories from indigenous tribes, describing visitors who descended from the sky on pillars of wind, or ships that glowed like hot stone. The missionaries wrote these accounts in letters to Rome, sometimes with skepticism, sometimes with fear. Many of these letters arrived in the archives, were catalogued, and then quietly sealed. A few describe carvings found deep within jungles, carvings showing tall beings with elongated skulls, large eyes, and objects held in their hands that looked like rods, discs, or tablets. The missionaries asked whether these symbols should be destroyed or preserved. Rome's answer was always the same: preserve everything, but release nothing. Over centuries, the Vatican gathered an unintentional map of humanity's forgotten visitors, a map made not of drawings or coordinates, but of patterns, repeating descriptions, shared memories, identical symbols appearing in cultures separated by oceans and time. And yet this map was never spoken aloud, never drawn on paper, never acknowledged outside the archivist's room. It lived only in the knowledge of those who handled the manuscripts and imposed their silence upon themselves, because they understood what the full picture implied. The picture was this: humanity had never been as alone as it believed. Its earliest teachers may not have been mortal. Its earliest kings may have been chosen by visitors whose origins were not divine in the way doctrine insisted. And the beings once called gods may have walked the earth with feet that pressed into the soil, leaving footprints that now lie buried in dust, older than any empire. Imagine walking through the archives after midnight, long after the librarians have gone home. The echo of your steps lasts a moment too long, as if the walls themselves are listening. The lamps cast soft pools of light on shelves that stretch far into the darkness. You run your hand along the spines of ancient volumes, feeling the ridges of leather hardened by time. Somewhere deeper inside, in rooms lit only by low, protected lights, lie the documents few are allowed to touch. Clay tablets resting in cushioned trays, Sumerian rubbings preserved in sealed envelopes, letters from missionaries sealed with wax darkened by centuries, astronomical observations written by Jesuit scholars who documented movements in the night sky that do not match known stars. The atmosphere changes as you walk deeper, becoming heavier, quieter, as if the very air is aware of your presence. Archivists often say the deepest rooms feel occupied, not by people, but by centuries of withheld knowledge, a presence heavier than silence. Here, humanity's forgotten chapters are not dead, they sleep, waiting for someone with permission to turn their pages, and yet permission is rarely granted. Even scholars trusted with access speak only in vague terms, careful not to reveal what they have seen. They describe feeling watched, not by eyes, but by the weight of truths that cannot move, cannot speak, but insist on being sensed. Among these documents, there are manuscripts that early translators struggled to interpret, phrases describing tools that glowed with inner fire, symbols representing constellations not visible from Earth's ancient skies, diagrams too precise to be decorative, too complex to be purely artistic. Some scholars believed these diagrams to be symbolic maps of the cosmos. Others believed they represented machines, constructs of metal and light, used by beings who descended from the sky in ages when humanity was still young. These interpretations are never included in public papers. They are written in private notes, bound into volumes with restricted access, and stored where only a handful of archivists ever go. There are also records of early Christian encounters that did not fit neatly into theology. One describes a group of shepherds near the desert who saw a radiant shape descend behind a hill, leaving scorched stone in its wake. Another speaks of a hermit who witnessed 3 beings, tall as cedar trees, who appeared without casting shadows, and spoke of a time before the first children of Adam. These accounts were treated carefully, not as heresy, but as matters too delicate to incorporate into doctrine. They were archived, not explained, preserved, not integrated. The Vatican is not an institution that destroys. It stores, it categorizes, it protects. And in its effort to protect, it has become the custodian of truths humanity forgot long before it learned to doubt. The men who guard these documents understand their importance, even if they never speak of them. They know that behind the familiar story of creation, behind the familiar imagery of angels and heaven, there lies another story, longer, stranger, older than Scripture. A story where beings from the sky touch the earth not as symbols, but as presences. As you walk through the deepest rooms, the quiet becomes nearly physical. The shelves stretch into the shadows like rib bones of a sleeping leviathan. The documents resting there do not shout, they whisper. And their whisper is always the same. That humanity remembers only fragments of a much older relationship. That once, long ago, the sky was not a mystery but a threshold. That the beings we call gods, angels, watchers, or myths may have walked beside the first humans, guiding them, shaping them, teaching them. And that somewhere in these archives lies the record of that forgotten age, kept safe not because it is false, but because it is too powerful. This is why the Vatican holds its silence, not to deceive, not to dominate, but to protect a world that may not know how to carry a truth older than religion, older than culture, older than the memory of the stars themselves. Tonight, as the city sleeps above the stone floors, the archives breathe quietly in the dark. Their shelves cradle the weight of millennia. Their documents rest like dormant seeds. And in the stillness of those rooms, the presence of the old visitors lingers, not in flesh, not in form, but in memory. A memory waiting, patient and vast, for the moment humanity is finally ready to understand what it once knew. Some truths do not fade, they sink. They settle into the deepest layers of human history, like sediment beneath a river, compacted by time, preserved by silence. And though the world above moves on, building cities, writing scriptures, naming saints, the oldest truths remain untouched beneath it all, waiting for the rare moment when someone dares to look down instead of forward. In the centuries after Rome embraced Christianity, the Church inherited far more than faith. It inherited the remnants of a world older than any gospel, a world where the sky was alive with visitors and human destiny was shaped not solely by divine providence, but by encounters with beings whose footsteps left impressions deeper than myth. These remnants did not arrive as a unified story. They came scattered, in broken tablets, in desert inscriptions, in myths whispered by tribes untouched by civilization, in symbols carved into temple walls that had already stood for thousands of years when the first Christian martyrs drew breath. The Church, with its expanding influence, became the center of accumulation. Manuscripts from Egypt, scrolls from Judea, codices from Greece, tablets from the Near East, all converged upon Rome like rivers returning to a hidden sea. And within this convergence, patterns emerged. Patterns that theologians recognized immediately, though few dared to speak aloud. Patterns that suggested the world humanity inherited was shaped by intelligences older than Scripture's timeline. Patterns that linked angels to watchers, watchers to sky gods to the Anunnaki, and the Anunnaki to something far larger than religion was prepared to embrace. The stories of these beings were not vague or inconsistent. They were precise, too precise. Their depictions did not shift wildly between cultures. Their functions remained the same across continents. Teachers of astronomy, bearers of law, builders of cities, guardians of early kings, messengers between heaven and earth, and always descending from the sky. No culture described them emerging from forests or oceans or mountains. They came from above, from realms humanity could see but never reach. These similarities troubled early church scholars, not because they contradicted faith, but because they paralleled it too closely. The church needed the heavens to belong to one story, one revelation, one divine authority. A shared origin between religions would dissolve borders that had taken centuries to build. And so, slowly, carefully, the church divided the world into sacred and profane. Anything that supported the singular narrative became canon. Anything that connected the old sky beings to angels, or angels to watchers, or watchers to the Anunnaki, was quietly set aside, folded into apocrypha, or sealed in vaults where only select scholars could read it under dim lamplight. But the world outside Rome did not stop remembering. In the mountains of Armenia, old families told stories of luminous beings who taught their ancestors the star cycles. In Ethiopia, ancient texts described sky messengers who brought metal tools that shone like the midday sun. In India, the Vedic hymns continued to speak of beings who traversed the heavens in chariots of fire, their breath described as lightning, their voices like thunder rolling across stone. The Church catalogued these accounts, studied them, compared them, and came to understand something it could not easily reveal. These were not separate myths. They were fragments of a single memory shared across humanity. There were meetings, quiet gatherings of scholars dressed in simple robes, where these patterns were discussed with nervous precision. Not debates, but confessions, private acknowledgements that the ancient world held a secret too large to fit into doctrine. Some scholars argued that these beings might have been early angels, misunderstood and misnamed by civilizations that lacked theology. Others suggested they were manifestations of God's power, seen through the lens of early cultures. But a small group, the ones who studied the oldest tablets, the ones who spoke the languages of Sumer and Akkad, recognized the uncomfortable possibility that these beings were not symbolic at all. One translator, whose private notes are still kept under restricted access, wrote that certain tablets described crafts that rose not by wind or flame, but by a force unknown. Another described a being with clothing that glowed without fire and eyes like polished stone. A third wrote that the Sumerian phrase often translated as descended in glory could be more accurately rendered as landed with brilliance, a description too physical to ignore. The Church never declared these translators heretics. It never punished them. It simply took their notes, placed them in sealed drawers, and closed the door gently. Not suppression, not denial. Containment. Over time, the scholars learned the boundaries. They wrote carefully. They avoided literal interpretations. They spoke of symbolism rather than technology, metaphor rather than memory. And yet in private journals, many confessed the same quiet conclusion. The beings described by the ancient world behaved nothing like the spiritual angels depicted in later paintings. They behaved like emissaries, envoys from a distant realm, bearing knowledge and tools beyond the understanding of early humans. The deeper you walk into the archives, the more visible this quiet tension becomes. Manuscripts that should contradict each other instead align. Flood narratives written centuries apart mirror one another with disturbing precision. Creation stories told by tribes on separate continents follow identical sequences of intervention and instruction. And nearly every ancient culture preserves a memory of a time when visitors walked among humans, guiding them before vanishing into the sky. Some archivists whisper that the Vatican possesses a set of clay fragments too damaged for display, but deciphered long ago. These fragments allegedly describe a council of sky beings debating whether humanity was ready for certain knowledge. The text is incomplete, many lines are missing, but one phrase, copied by a 19th century translator, survived clearly. The children are not yet ready for the fire of heaven. A poetic line, perhaps, or a literal one. Among the most guarded items of all is said to be a set of astronomical tablets whose numeric values match modern star distances with uncanny accuracy. Scholars suggested coincidence. Others suggested ancient genius. But a few believed the tablets were not describing the stars as seen from Earth, but as seen from somewhere else, a vantage point humanity did not possess. As centuries passed, the Church's silence became a form of protection, not to hide evil, but to avoid chaos. The Vatican understood that destabilizing human identity was dangerous. Faith unravels slowly when pressed with truths it is not prepared to absorb. Civilizations fracture when their origin stories collapse all at once. By maintaining silence, the Church preserved order while keeping humanity's most ancient memories safely intact. Yet, silence has a cost. As the world modernized, scientific progress began circling the same questions the ancient world had already answered in mythic form. Astronomers found worlds beyond our own. Biologists saw genetic hints that challenged linear evolution. Linguists identified anomalies in the earliest languages that suggested foreign influence. And through it all, the Vatican watched quietly, its archives holding the answers humanity was rediscovering, piece by fragile piece. There is a room in the archives, rarely visited, where the luminescent glow of preservation lamps reflects off glass cases containing documents older than nations. Here, the air feels colder, as if the past has a temperature of its own. Archivists describe a sensation of walking not through a room, but through time, a place where the breath of the ancient world lingers. Shelves curve in long arcs, holding every form of memory: clay tablets, papyrus rolls, vellum manuscripts, star charts drawn by forgotten hands, and codices bound in leather that crackles like dry leaves. If you stand still in this room long enough, you feel something subtle but unmistakable: the presence of a question. Not spoken, not written, but woven into the space like a quiet vibration. A question humanity asked long ago and then forgot to keep asking. A question the visitors once answered directly when they walked among early kings and shepherds. Who else was here? The documents in this room do not answer outright. They do not name the Anunnaki in bold letters or describe their craft in modern terms, but they whisper, they hint, they align, and together they suggest a truth the world has been circling for centuries: that humanity was shaped by more than earth and chance, more than myth and imagination, that once, in an age now buried beneath civilizations, beings descended from the sky and left behind knowledge, memory, and traces of their presence scattered like stardust across cultures. The Church keeps these documents safe, not because they are false, but because they are powerful. Power demands caution, and caution demands silence. Yet the silence cannot last forever. The more humanity looks upward, the more familiar the sky begins to feel. The more we understand science, the more ancient myths begin to sound like history. The more we uncover about our own past, the more the line between angel and visitor blurs. The Vatican knows that one day, the world will ask the question again, openly, fearlessly, collectively. And when that moment comes, the archives will not need to speak. Humanity will already know where to look. The truth will rise, not in a single revelation, but in the quiet recognition that the oldest stories, the ones preserved in clay and sealed in vaults, were never myths at all. They were memories of a time when the sky was not silent, and the beings who walked in that time may still be watching. In every age, there comes a moment when memory tries to return to the surface, rising like a forgotten island from beneath the waves. Civilizations feel it long before they name it. A tension, a pull, a sense that the world holds more than the stories written in its sacred books. The Vatican has lived through countless such moments, ages when humanity almost remembered, almost pieced together the fragments scattered across continents. Each time, the same pattern unfolded: discovery, curiosity, fear, containment. It is an ancient rhythm, older than Rome, older than the Church, older even than the civilizations that first recorded the presence of the Watchers. During the Renaissance, explorers returning from distant shores carried with them not just gold and spices, but stories. Stories of people who spoke of sky teachers and luminous visitors who descended from mountains wrapped in clouds of fire. Some explorers dismissed these tales as superstition. Others recorded them carefully, sending their notes back to Europe where scholars debated their meaning by candlelight. Many of these accounts ended up in Vatican storage, not suppressed, but quietly relocated to rooms where only trained eyes would ever see them. One such account, faded and brittle with age, describes a tribe deep in the Amazon who claimed their ancestors learned metalworking from beings whose skin shone like morning light. Another, written by a Jesuit in the 1600s, tells of a ceremony he witnessed among an African people who honored those who came from the night sky, carving symbols of spirals and wings into stone altars that predated their own culture by centuries. The Jesuit believed he had stumbled upon remnants of an ancient religion. What he did not understand, though the Vatican likely did, was that he had found a memory older than religion itself. These stories were not isolated. They formed a constellation of their own, each point shining faintly across history, waiting for someone to draw the lines between them. But the Vatican, knowing the implications, never drew those lines publicly. It did not need to. The lines were already drawn within the archives, in the minds of scholars who had spent their lives tracing echoes through languages, symbols, and forgotten manuscripts. In time, Europe's scholars began noticing the same parallels on their own. Astronomers uncovered ancient star maps that seemed impossibly advanced. Historians found architectural patterns recurring across civilizations with no contact between them. Linguists recognized phrases in ancient languages that hinted at celestial origins. These discoveries brushed the edge of a great revelation, but never crossed it. Not because the truth was hidden, but because it was too immense to fit inside the framework scholars trusted. Meanwhile, in Rome, the archives continued to grow. New manuscripts arrived yearly from missions, excavations, and private donations. Some were catalogued openly. Others were placed in drawers without public reference, not out of malice, but because the men who handled them recognized the same quiet danger. The world was not ready to know that its oldest stories might be grounded in reality. There are descriptions of ancient artifacts found in desert ruins, objects that seem to combine stone with metal, crafted with precision tools no known civilization possessed. Missionaries often sent sketches of these artifacts back to Rome, unsure of what they had discovered. A few described them as mixed creations, part human workmanship, part something beyond human capability. Those artifacts, if they still exist, are not in museums. They rest in rooms few have seen, their surfaces protected from light, their shapes preserved as if waiting for a time when humanity can finally comprehend what they represent. Archivists have spoken quietly, never in official capacity, never in writing, about one object in particular. A fragment of what appears to be a circular device, its edges carved with symbols resembling both Sumerian cuneiform and an unknown script. The material is not quite stone, not quite metal. It is cold to the touch, even in warm rooms. The fragment was found in a temple ruin in the Near East during the 19th century, brought to Rome by a missionary who believed it might be a ritual object. But scholars examining it privately noted something strange. The symbols were not decorative. They formed a sequence, like instructions or a map. What the sequence describes remains unclear, but those who have studied it feel certain it was meant to be read, not revered. Such artifacts challenge every assumption about the ancient world. They do not fit comfortably into theology, archaeology, or anthropology, and so they rest where they cannot cause confusion, where they can wait quietly for a moment when their meaning can be embraced without fear. Even now there are researchers, careful, quiet, and deeply aware of the boundaries, who spend their careers reading the earliest myths with a different lens. They know that myths are not always inventions. They are often metaphors shaped around memories the mind could not fully grasp. When a shepherd in ancient Sumer saw a bright craft descending from the sky, he did not write about engines or vehicles. He wrote in the language he had: wings of fire, chariots of light, beings wrapped in radiance. To dismiss these descriptions as primitive metaphor is to underestimate the sophistication of the ancient world. These were not ignorant people. They were observers of the natural world with extraordinary precision. Their descriptions reflected what they saw, not what they imagined. And everywhere, the beings they saw behaved the same way. They descended, they taught, they instructed, they measured, they built, they chose leaders, and when the work was done, they returned to the sky. This consistency is difficult to explain through invention alone. Civilizations separated by oceans should not share the same stories, with the same structure, unless they are remembering the same encounters. The Vatican has always understood this. It has had access to the pieces for centuries. While the rest of the world studied fragments in isolation, Rome studied the whole tapestry, or at least enough of it to see the outline. And the outline was unmistakable. Humanity's earliest teachers were not bound to earth. In the quiet hours of the night, some scholars have admitted that the Church's silence was not simply strategic, it was also protective. Faith is delicate when confronted too abruptly with truths that shift the ground beneath it. Many people draw their sense of purpose, morality, and identity from the belief that humanity occupies a special place in creation. To tell the world that ancient visitors may have played a role in shaping early civilization is not merely to introduce a new fact, It is to redefine the meaning of humanity itself. And yet, the archives are full of reminders that humanity has been asking this question all along. The prophets asked it. The kings asked it. The forgotten priests of old temples asked it. The shepherds who saw lights in the sky asked it. The scribes who pressed their stories into clay asked it. Who are we? Where did we come from? Why did the visitors choose us? The silence preserved by the Vatican is not an answer. It is a pause, a long, deliberate pause, waiting for the moment when humanity is ready to ask the question without fear, without fracturing, without needing the old stories to hold their original shape. Perhaps that is why the archives feel alive, because they do not simply contain documents, they contain potential, the possibility that one day the world will be ready to hear the story that connects the Anunnaki to the Watchers to the angels, and the angels to the beings that walked beside humanity before written history began. Some truths do not need to be announced. They reveal themselves slowly, piece by piece, until the world finally recognizes the shape they were forming all along. And when that moment comes, the Vatican's silence will no longer be a barrier. It will be an acknowledgement that humanity has finally grown into the questions it has been afraid to ask. When that day arrives, the archives will not open suddenly, with fanfare or revelation. They will open quietly, naturally, as if they had been waiting for centuries for the world to exhale and say, "We are ready to remember." And in that moment, the story of the Anunnaki will return not as myth, not as heresy, but as memory. There are nights in Rome when the sky feels too heavy, as if the stars themselves are leaning closer, watching with an ancient familiarity that civilization has forgotten how to sense. On those nights, when the lamps flicker across the cobblestones and the city quiets to a hush that feels older than language, the walls of the Vatican seem to breathe differently, as though something within them remembers what the world outside has forgotten. As though the silence inside the archives is not emptiness, but anticipation. For centuries, visitors to Vatican City have spoken of an odd sensation that settles over them unexpectedly, a feeling of being observed, not by people, but by time, a sense that the stones themselves carry memory. Most dismiss it as awe or the weight of history. But those who know how to listen understand that this feeling is not projection. It is resonance, a quiet hum that lingers in places where truth has been stored for too long without voice. Deep within the restricted corridors, archivists describe whispers, not sounds, but impressions. The feeling that the documents are aware of being read, aware of the hands that turn their pages. Awareness is not a word scholars use lightly, yet many have felt it. That subtle presence, shaped not by spirits or dreams, but by truths that have waited centuries for understanding. When ancient stories are held too tightly, they acquire a kind of gravity, drawing the reader into the world they describe. And nowhere is this truer than in the manuscripts concerning humanity's earliest teachers. Some of these manuscripts originate from monasteries high in the mountains, where isolation preserved knowledge untouched by councils or kingdoms. In those remote sanctuaries, monks copied older texts with meticulous devotion, sometimes preserving stories the Church considered unsuitable for public doctrine. A few of these texts now lie in the Vatican, fragile leaves of parchment written in faded ink, telling of luminous beings who descended on nights when the stars flickered as if stirred by wind. The monks wrote of hearing voices in languages they could not understand, voices that felt both gentle and overwhelming, like distant thunder that resonates behind the ribs rather than through the ears. One monk described a presence that stood at the edge of his vision, tall and motionless, its shape outlined not by light but by absence, as if it displaced the air around it. He said it watched him for several minutes, leaving him frozen with a strange mixture of fear and tranquility. When he finally gathered the courage to look directly at it, the figure vanished, leaving behind a faint scent of cold earth and a lingering warmth in the room. He wrote that he did not believe it was an angel. Its presence was too physical, too grounded, yet it radiated a kind of intelligence that felt older than scripture. These accounts are treated with reverence but kept out of public discourse. The Church understands their value, but it also understands their danger. Not because they contradict faith, but because they expand it beyond the boundaries that centuries of doctrine have built. When faith expands too quickly, it can fracture. And so these stories rest quietly in the archives, waiting for the day when humanity is strong enough to hear them without fear. Beyond the monasteries, missionaries across the world encountered traditions that echoed the same presence. In the high plateaus of Asia, elders spoke of beings with elongated faces and luminous skin who taught their ancestors to measure the movements of the stars. In the Pacific Islands, navigators told stories of sky ancestors who descended on nights when the ocean glowed silver, leaving behind knowledge of winds, currents, and constellations. Among the Andean cultures, stone carvings depict figures with large eyes and strange devices hanging from their waists, standing among humans as equals, not as gods or conquerors. These stories, recorded in letters by missionaries, were often dismissed as pagan myth. But when the letters arrived in Rome, the scholars who read them noticed the same pattern they had seen in the Sumerian tablets, the Hebrew writings, the Vedic hymns, and the apocryphal texts. The beings always descended, always taught, always departed, and always left behind a sense of longing, as if humanity had been touched by something vast and patient. In the archives, there are documents noting that certain symbols recur across continents with uncanny precision. Spirals intertwined with wings, stars within circles, figures with arms outstretched toward objects descending from the sky. The same symbols appear in the temples of ancient Egypt, the stonework of Mesoamerica, the petroglyphs of Australia, and the pottery of the Near East. Scholars have suggested independent invention, but those who have seen enough of the archives understand that parallel invention on this scale is improbable. Memory shared across thousands of years and thousands of miles is rarely coincidence. Some researchers quietly believe that these symbols were taught intentionally, a universal language left by the visitors to ensure humanity remembered them. But over millennia, memory became myth, myth became religion, and religion became doctrine. The visitors were transformed into gods, angels, ancestors, or spirits depending on the culture that inherited the memory. Their physical presence became metaphor, their technology became miracles, their teachings became commandments, and their departure became heaven. In the Vatican's deepest rooms, preserved under layers of careful protection, lie early drafts of biblical texts, versions written before councils standardized their content. These drafts include passages that differ subtly from their final form. A phrase that once implied descent becomes one that implies revelation. A word meaning "those who travel the heights" is replaced with "messengers." A description of fiery structures that rose into the sky becomes visions of divine glory. These changes were not malicious. They were attempts to translate ancient concepts into a spiritual framework suitable for an emerging religion. But in the process, the physical nature of the visitors was softened, their presence recast as symbolic. Some passages that described beings walking among early humans were removed entirely. Others were shortened. A few were moved into apocryphal texts, and many were preserved only in private commentary by scholars who recognized the difficulty of merging ancient cosmic memory with the theology of their time. Yet even with these changes, traces remain. The story of Enoch ascending to heaven without death, the tale of Elijah taken by a chariot of fire, the vision of Ezekiel describing wheels within wheels and beings of burning metal. These accounts are not spiritual abstractions. They read like encounters with something tangible, something immense, something that existed before doctrine softened their edges. The Church could not erase these stories, even if it had wanted to. They are part of the structure of Scripture, embedded too deeply to remove. So instead, they were reinterpreted. A chariot of fire became a symbol. A wheel of metal became a vision. A being of radiant substance became an angel. And the ancient memory of celestial visitors slipped quietly into the realm of spiritual metaphor. But the archives remember. The documents stored there preserve the older interpretations, the original contexts, the linguistic nuances that suggest something more literal than metaphor. Scholars who study them do so with caution, recognizing the delicate balance between revelation and disruption. They understand that the world is not yet ready for a sudden return of memory. But they also sense that the world is moving slowly, inevitably, toward the truth. Humanity is no longer bound by the limits of ancient understanding. We build machines that pierce the heavens, send instruments to distant planets, and map galaxies with precision undreamed of by earlier civilizations. As our knowledge expands, the ancient stories begin to sound less like myth and more like testimony. The watchers described in old texts resemble travelers more than spirits. The sky chariots resemble craft more than symbols. The beings of radiance resemble explorers more than angels. There is a quiet irony in this. Humanity is becoming the very thing it once described in mythic terms. The explorers of tomorrow may one day descend upon distant worlds, luminous in the eyes of cultures far less advanced. And those cultures may carve their memory into stone, describing them as gods or watchers, just as our ancestors did. Perhaps this is the true cycle, the universe teaching itself through stories repeated across civilizations. Tonight, as the hush of the Vatican settles into its deepest corridors, the documents sleep like dormant embers. They wait for the moment when humanity is ready to see them not as threats but as bridges. The truth they carry is not a challenge to faith, but an expansion of it. The visitors did not replace the divine. They were part of the same vast tapestry, woven into the earliest chapters of human experience. One day, when the world steps beyond fear and into understanding, the archives may open. Not because the church decides it, but because humanity will already know. The truth will not arrive as revelation. It will rise like dawn over a landscape that was always there, waiting to be seen. And the memory of the Anunnaki, those ancient teachers who walked with our earliest ancestors, will return quietly, naturally, like a long-forgotten dream finally waking in the collective mind of humanity. There are moments in history when silence changes shape. It is no longer an absence of sound, but a presence of something unspoken, hovering at the edges of awareness like a shadow stretching across centuries. The Vatican lives inside such silence. It has carried it for generations. A silence not born of secrecy, but of weight. The weight of holding a story older than scripture, older than empire, older than the very idea of religion itself. A story preserved in thousands of fragments scattered through time. In the dim glow of the archive lamps, those fragments still breathe. The scent of ancient paper mixes with dust and faint traces of ink that once flowed from the hands of scribes long gone. Some pages are so delicate that they must be turned with wooden tools instead of fingers. Others are hardened by age, textured like dry bark. When archivists handle them, they do so with the reverence usually reserved for relics. Because these manuscripts are relics in their own way, remnants of an age before memory fragmented into belief. Among the most enigmatic of these documents are the cosmic hymns, ancient chants copied by early monks who believed they were preserving sacred poetry. But closer inspection reveals something different. The hymns do not praise gods in the way later scriptures do. They describe alignments of stars, the timing of celestial cycles, the descent of luminous forms on particular nights, and strange relationships between the heavens and the earth. These hymns are not worship, they are observation. They are records of celestial events witnessed by people who used the language of devotion, because they had no other vocabulary for what descended from the sky. Scholars who study these hymns privately have noted details that cannot be dismissed as symbolism. Descriptions of patterns in the night sky that match star charts unknown to the ancient world. References to objects that moved against the natural flow of constellations. Lines describing visitors whose garments glowed like heated metal. The hymns were preserved not because they were understood, but because they were beautiful, haunting expressions of awe that captured something humanity was not yet ready to name. In another part of the archives lies a collection of letters written by early travelers who ventured into deserts and mountains in search of solitude. These men were not missionaries. They were wanderers, ascetics seeking visions, hermits searching for truth in the wilderness. Their letters tell stories of encounters with shapes that appeared over the horizon at dusk, drifting silently across the sky like wandering stars. They describe sensations of warmth and pressure, as if the air itself responded to the presence of something unseen yet powerful. One hermit wrote that a soft humming accompanied the lights, a hum that vibrated in his bones rather than in the open air. These accounts were never condemned. The church preserved them without explanation, recognizing that the wilderness often reveals things the cities forget. The hermits did not interpret these lights as divine or demonic. They simply described them with honesty and uncertainty. Their accounts echo the writings of ancient shepherds, sailors, and travelers across millennia. all witnessing the same phenomenon, all struggling to describe it with the vocabulary of their time. In more recent centuries, as European scholars explored ancient ruins, they uncovered carvings that perplexed even the most learned academics. Figures with proportions too perfect for myth, beings holding objects shaped like rods, spheres, or discs with intricate patterns. Sculptures depicting humans standing beside towering visitors whose helmets resembled elongated domes or radiating halos. The resemblance to the visitors of Mesopotamian lore was unmistakable. Yet these carvings were found in places that had never known Sumer or Akkad. The scholars sent sketches of these carvings to Rome. Some believed they had discovered lost gods. Others believed they had uncovered some form of ritual symbolism. But the sketches were filed with quiet care, placed alongside earlier depictions from Sumer, Babylon, Egypt, and Mesoamerica. When viewed side by side, the pattern sharpened into focus. The beings carved into stone were not isolated inventions. They were part of a shared memory that transcended continents. The Vatican never published these comparisons. It did not need to. The archives themselves held the story. A story woven through artifacts, carvings, manuscripts, and traditions. A story that grew clearer with each fragment added to the collection. In the 19th century, an archaeologist sent a report describing a stone panel discovered in a desert ruin, depicting a line of figures ascending toward a luminous object hovering above the ground. The light rays were carved with precision, each beam etched with grooves suggesting movement or energy. The faces of the ascending figures were serene, as if rising towards something familiar rather than frightening. The archaeologist wrote that the panel felt more like a record than a myth. When the report reached Rome, the panel was carefully transferred into the Vatican's custody. It was never displayed, but it remains preserved, protected from environmental decay, waiting for a world that can read its meaning without fear. Not all manuscripts in the archives describe visitors in physical form. Some speak of voices that came from the sky, voices that resonated with a clarity beyond human sound. Early tribes recorded these voices in their own languages, often describing them as commands, warnings, or instructions. The tribes did not claim the voices belonged to their gods. They believed the voices belonged to teachers, beings who guided them in times of crisis, teaching them how to grow food, craft tools, or survive disasters. One document, written by a missionary in the early 1700s and kept in restricted access, describes a tribe in Africa that believed their ancestors were taught by the luminous ones who descended in storms of silver light. The missionary dismissed their story as myth, but he admitted privately that the tribe possessed astronomical knowledge far beyond what their technology suggested. They could track the stars with precision, predict seasonal changes, and identify constellations unknown to the Western world. Their knowledge had no clear origin, yet they insisted it came from the visitors. The missionary sent artifacts to Rome along with his report. Stone instruments carved with strange grooves, patterns resembling star maps, and symbols that appeared neither African nor European. These artifacts were catalogued and placed in protective storage. They were never returned to the tribe, and their meaning remains unclear even today. In the deepest chambers of the archives, there are documents so old and fragile they can only be read under controlled conditions. These documents speak of a time before recorded history, a time when humanity had not yet learned to fear the sky. The stories suggest that the visitors were not outsiders but partners. They lived among humans, teaching them skills that transformed scattered tribes into civilizations. They taught early people how to build stone structures with angles too precise for primitive tools, how to carve symbols that aligned with celestial events, and how to track the movement of the stars across centuries. Then, abruptly, the visitors left. The documents do not explain why. Some suggest they returned to the heavens when humanity reached a certain stage. Others imply that humanity had begun to stray from the teachings, leading the visitors to withdraw. A few texts hint at a silence that fell over the earth, a silence that left humanity grieving, confused, and desperate for the return of the sky teachers. This longing echoes in myths across the world, in prayers for beings who once walked among mortals and promised to return. The Vatican has spent centuries guarding this memory, not because it is dangerous, but because it is transformative. The truth that lies within the archives does not diminish faith. It expands it. It reveals that the universe is vast, that creation is ancient, and that humanity has been part of a cosmic dialogue far longer than Scripture suggests. The Church understands that one day humanity will be ready for this truth, not through revelation, but through recognition, through discovery, through the slow, steady return of the same question asked by shepherds beneath the night sky thousands of years ago. Who else is out there? The answer does not need to be shouted. It is already written in clay, in stone, in ink, in the memory carried through generations. The visitors were here. They walked with us. They taught us. They watched us. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the glow of our cities, they still do. There is a particular room, deep beneath the archives, where the air feels different from the rest of the Vatican. Archivists say it is because of the temperature controls or the density of materials stored there. But those who have stood inside it alone, long after the lamps have dimmed, describe something else. A sensation not of cold, but of presence. A feeling that the room is saturated with meaning, as though every scrap of parchment and broken fragment of clay is part of an unseen constellation, each piece pointing toward the same ancient truth. This room holds the documents that are considered too delicate to move and too ambiguous to display. They were gathered over centuries from monasteries, caves, ruins, and forgotten sanctuaries. Some arrived wrapped in cloth woven so old that the fibers crumble at the edges. Others arrived concealed inside wooden chests, discovered in abandoned hermitages. A few were found hidden behind old walls during restoration work, placed there by monks who understood that the future might not be ready for their contents. Inside this room, on a shelf so old it has been repaired dozens of times, there is a manuscript copied by a monk who traveled through the Middle East during the 12th century. He writes of a village that claimed its ancestors were visited by 3 luminous figures who descended on a stairway of light. The villagers believed these beings taught their people how to read the sky, how to create irrigation systems, and how to build stone dwellings that resisted floods. The monk calls these stories echoes of the ancient teachers, though he admits he does not know who the teachers were. He writes one line that stands out from the rest, as if he understood he was copying something more important than folklore. They said the sky opened like a curtain, and beyond it were stars brighter than fire. He doesn't question the statement, he simply records it. And in doing so, he preserves a memory that had lived in that village for centuries before he arrived. Nearby, on another fragile shelf, lies a scroll from a monastery in Armenia. It describes a mountain where, according to the monks, the Watchers of the Dawn once stood. The scroll claims the Watchers descended in pairs, tall beings whose clothing shimmered like water. They carried objects that emitted light even at midday, and their voices were described as resonant as metal struck with a hammer. The monks believed these Watchers taught their ancestors mathematics and the movements of the heavens. They left behind stone markers aligned with specific stars, alignments that modern researchers later confirmed with precision, far beyond the technological abilities of the era. The Vatican never declared these scrolls heretical. It simply placed them in storage, preserving them without explanation. The scholars who read them understood that if they were released publicly, they would invite questions the Church could not easily answer. Questions about who these luminous beings were. Questions about why they appeared across so many cultures. Questions about why their teachings were so consistent. And questions about why, after centuries of walking among humans, they suddenly vanished. On another table in the same room lies a broken set of clay fragments, discovered near an ancient riverbank in Mesopotamia. The fragments are inscribed with cuneiform symbols, so worn that half the text is missing. What remains describes a gathering of the Great Ones, meeting to decide whether humanity should be given knowledge of the heavens. The text mentions gifts of the sky and the measuring of seasons. It also speaks of a time when humans were lifted from dust and taught the ways of the wandering stars. The Vatican's translation notes remark that the phrases resemble both Sumerian and early Hebrew cosmology, suggesting a connection between traditions that should have been unrelated. Yet the connection exists in the archives. It lives in the parallels scholars have quietly observed for centuries. It appears in stories from Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Stories of beings who walked among humans, luminous and tall, teaching without dominating, guiding without ruling. There are reports written by early explorers who visited remote tribes and recorded tales of sky ancestors who descended in great storms. These tribes often possessed knowledge that seemed misplaced. Calendars aligned with star patterns, advanced agricultural techniques, and precise understanding of solar cycles. The Vatican stored these reports not because they contradicted doctrine, but because they complemented something older, something the Church understood but never publicly acknowledged. Every culture, no matter how distant, speaks of a moment when humanity was visited. Some describe these visitors as gods. Others call them ancestors. Others say they were travelers, teachers, or guardians. The words differ, but the structure remains the same. They descended. They instructed. They departed. They promised to return. The archives contain a letter written by a 17th century priest who spent years living among an indigenous group in South America. He describes a ritual performed under the full moon, in which the tribe sang songs honoring the shining visitors who came before. The songs mention a time when the visitors guided their ancestors through a great catastrophe involving fire from the sky. They led the people into the mountains, taught them to survive, then returned to the heavens on pillars of wind. The priest wrote that the ritual felt less like mythology and more like commemoration, a memory preserved through music. The Vatican stored his letter along with sketches he made of the tribe's carvings. The carvings depict tall figures with elongated heads, holding round objects in their hands. Above them are symbols resembling concentric circles, spirals, and rays of light. The priest believed these carvings represented the sun and moon, but scholars viewing them centuries later noticed their resemblance to symbols carved in ancient temples half a world away. In one corner of the archive room lies a manuscript written by a medieval astronomer. He claims to have witnessed a wandering star that moved erratically across the night sky, stopping and changing direction in ways no celestial object should. He describes its glow as metallic, its movement as intentional. He concludes his account by wondering whether he had glimpsed one of the ancient travelers spoken of in the hidden texts. This phrase suggests he had read manuscripts not meant for public view, documents stored even then in restricted sections of the archives. The Vatican never challenged his account, it simply preserved it. That is how the Church has always handled the truth too large for doctrine. Preserve, protect, never deny, never confirm. Over the centuries, as science advanced and telescopes revealed the true scale of the universe, the ancient stories began to sound less like fantasy and more like memory viewed through the limitations of ancient eyes. Early humans had no words for craft, machinery, or extraterrestrial visitors. They described what they saw using the language they had: fire, wings, chariots, radiance, heavenly descent. These metaphors hardened into myth, and myth hardened into religion. But beneath it all, the original encounters remained. In the Vatican's oldest writings, there are hints of debates among theologians who questioned how angels should be described. Some argued that angels were pure spirit, incapable of physical form. Others insisted that early descriptions, beings of metal, fire, and radiant bodies, should be taken literally. A few suggested that the beings who appeared to ancient prophets may have been the same visitors recorded in Mesopotamian and Mediterranean texts. Their debates were recorded in private journals, never meant for public reading. These journals rest on shelves inside the deep archive room, lined up beside manuscripts that span thousands of years. Together, they tell a story far older than Christianity, older than Judaism, older than the foundations of civilization. A story of contact between early humans and beings who shaped the course of history, not by imposing their rule, but by offering knowledge. Some texts suggest that the visitors came during a time of great upheaval, floods, droughts, or astronomical events that threatened humanity's survival. Others claim the visitors were drawn to humanity's emerging potential, choosing to guide a species on the brink of transformation. A few more obscure manuscripts hint at disagreements among the visitors themselves, whether humans were ready, whether knowledge should be shared, whether contact should continue. These manuscripts do not name the visitors. They do not call them angels or gods. They describe them simply as the ones who descended, the luminous teachers, the tall ones, or those whose home is above the wandering stars. The Vatican scholars have long noted that these descriptions match the Sumerian accounts of the Anunnaki, and though they never conflate the two publicly, the parallels remain impossible to ignore. The Church's silence is not denial, it is preservation, a way of holding the truth steady until the world can absorb it without losing its balance. In the eyes of the Vatican, humanity is still growing, still evolving, still learning to understand its place in the cosmos. The truth about our ancient visitors is not a threat to faith. It is an expansion of its horizon. One day, when humanity's fear has softened into curiosity, when science and spirituality stand side by side without conflict, the archives may open their deepest rooms. They will not reveal a new religion, but an older memory. A memory humanity has carried in its stories, its symbols, its rituals, and its myths. A memory of the beings who once walked among us, who taught us, who left traces of their presence in every corner of the world. And perhaps, when the time is right, the visitors themselves may return, not as gods, not as saviors, but as the same ancient travelers who once descended from the sky and walked across our early world, leaving behind the knowledge that allowed civilizations to rise. Until then, the Vatican guards their memory in silence. A silence older than Scripture. A silence that waits, patient and eternal, like the night sky itself. There are parts of the Vatican archives that even most archivists never see. Not because they are forbidden, but because reaching them requires patience. A long series of corridors, a staircase that spirals like the inside of a seashell, a final hallway where the air becomes noticeably cooler, carrying the faint scent of stone, untouched by light for centuries. At the end of that hallway is a door so plain that most would walk past it without noticing. A simple wooden frame, iron hinges, no ornate carving, no sign to declare its purpose. But behind that door lies the most ancient memory the Church has ever preserved. Inside, the room is quiet in a way that feels deeper than silence. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something vast. The walls are lined with shelves that sag slightly under the weight of manuscripts older than kingdoms. There are clay tablets carefully placed inside padded drawers, rolls of papyrus sealed inside protective cases, fragments of stone inscriptions that once formed part of temple walls. The room feels like a fragment of another age, hidden beneath the world of today. Archivists say that when you stand inside this room, time feels layered, as though the present and the distant past overlap in thin, translucent sheets. You sense the presence of the scribes who pressed symbols into clay under the heat of ancient suns. You sense the hands of monks who copied forbidden lines long after dusk, dipping their quills into ink that smelled of smoke and resin. You sense the travelers who carried fragments of stories across deserts and oceans, wrapping them in cloth and hiding them from storms. The room is a living memory, and it welcomes only those who know how to listen. On one shelf rests a set of clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, so fragile that they are touched only with tools carved from soft wood. The symbols etched into them describe a council of sky beings who debated whether humanity was ready for certain knowledge. The tablets speak of a moment when the lords of the heavens descended to guide early humans through a cataclysmic event, a flood, a shifting of the earth, a darkening of the sky. The language is poetic, but the meaning is clear. The visitors intervened, not as gods demanding worship, but as guardians ensuring survival. The Church translated these tablets centuries ago. It recognized their significance immediately. They did not diminish faith, they expanded it. They suggested that divine guidance might manifest in many forms, through prophecy, through inspiration, and perhaps through the presence of ancient travelers whose origins lie beyond the stars. But because humanity was not ready to accept this possibility, the tablets were preserved quietly, their meaning held in trust for a future age. On another shelf lies a manuscript written by an early Christian mystic. He describes a dream in which he was lifted above the earth, passing through layers of sky that shimmered like glass. He saw beings traveling along paths of light, moving between stars with purposeful motion. The mystic believed he had been granted a vision of angels. But his description does not match later depictions of winged messengers. His angels were radiant figures encased in something like armor, moving with precision rather than fluttering wings. They communicated not with words, but with impressions, emotions transmitted like waves of warmth. He wrote that they were not bound to earth, and that their home lay far beyond the reach of human sight. This manuscript is kept alongside others from mystics who describe similar visions. Some experienced luminous beings descending on pillars of illumination. Others heard voices that resonated like metal struck in a cavern. A few saw patterns in the stars that seemed to rearrange themselves, as though signaling messages to those who knew how to interpret them. These visions were never condemned. The Church understood that mystics often glimpsed truths that doctrine struggled to articulate. But these writings remained private, preserved but never proclaimed. There is a scroll from a desert monastery written in a dialect so ancient that only a few scholars can fully read it. The scroll tells of a shining one who visited a group of shepherds after a night of strange light sweeping across the sky. The visitor taught them how to find water in the desert, how to read the stars for direction, and how to store grain so that it lasted through droughts. The visitor stayed with them for 3 days, then vanished into a cloud of silver mist. For generations, the tribe honored this figure as a teacher, not a god. The Church preserved the scroll because it recognized the story's remarkable resemblance to older texts, stories of beings who descended briefly to offer guidance, then departed. In another drawer rests a vellum manuscript from medieval Europe. It describes a monk who encountered what he called a traveler not of this earth. The traveler had eyes that shone like polished bronze and skin that glowed faintly. He wore garments that shimmered without movement, as though woven from light itself. The monk wrote that the traveler showed him visions of the earth from above, revealing rivers, mountains, and cities as they appeared from the sky. The monk believed the traveler was an angel. But the details he recorded align more closely with descriptions found in much older texts. Beings whose presence was physical, whose form was radiant, came from the heavens not as symbols but as explorers. Perhaps the most striking item in the room is a piece of stone carved with symbols that appear in no known alphabet. The stone is triangular, smooth on one side and intricately etched on the other. The symbols resemble a combination of spirals, lines, and geometric patterns. Scholars have theorized that the stone may be a fragment of a larger artifact. Some believe it could be a communication tool, others a ceremonial object. The Vatican has never released its analysis to the public, but archivists who have seen it up close say the stone emits a subtle warmth, as though it retains energy from a time long before modern civilizations. Many documents in the room hint at the same theme. Humanity once lived alongside visitors from beyond the sky. The visitors did not seek worship. They did not demand temples or sacrifices. They offered knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, architecture. They appeared during moments of upheaval, guided early humans through crises, and departed when their work was done. Their presence was recorded in symbols, preserved in myth, and echoed in religious texts that emerged thousands of years later. The Church understands that revealing this truth would change everything, not by destroying faith, but by expanding it into realms humanity is still learning to comprehend. This is why the archives remain quiet, not because the documents are dangerous, but because the world is not yet steady enough to accept their implications. Outside the archives, the Vatican's walls hold centuries of art depicting angels descending from the heavens. Their wings are symbolic, not literal. Their halos represent radiance, not metal. Their garments reflect divine light, not unknown materials. The artists who painted them were not eyewitnesses. They were interpreters, translating ancient memories into images the Church could endorse. Beneath these layers of symbolism lies a truth older than the paintings themselves, that the beings called angels in Scripture may once have been the same luminous visitors described in the clay tablets of Sumer, the scrolls of Egypt, the hymns of India, and the oral traditions of countless tribes. The Vatican knows this. It has known for centuries. Yet it also understands that truth reveals itself not through proclamation, but through readiness. Humanity must be prepared to see the visitors not as gods to be worshipped, but as travelers in a universe far older and wider than any doctrine suggests. Every year, scientists discover new planets orbiting distant stars. Astronomers detect signals from the depths of the cosmos. Biologists find life thriving in impossible places on Earth. Slowly, humanity is approaching a moment when the truth preserved in the archives will no longer feel impossible, when the ancient stories will no longer sound mythic, when the presence of the visitors will no longer be dismissed as imagination. When that moment comes, the silence will break naturally. The archives will not need to open dramatically. Humanity will recognize the truth on its own, and when it does, it will see that the beings once called the Anunnaki were not gods and not legends, but part of a long and mysterious history that stretches across the stars. Until then, the Vatican waits with patience older than empire. It guards the fragments of memory with steady hands, ensuring that the story written in clay and stone and parchment remains intact for the day when humanity finally looks to the sky and remembers what it once knew. In nights when the sky hangs low over Rome and the mist drifts like a veil across the cobblestones, the city feels strangely suspended, caught between what it remembers and what it tries to forget. The Vatican, illuminated by a handful of soft lights, looks less like a sovereign enclave and more like a lantern whose glow barely reaches the depths beneath it. Those depths hold the weight of millennia, preserved in rooms that have never known sunlight. And somewhere within those rooms lies a truth so old, it no longer feels like revelation. It feels like something humanity once knew, lost, and has been slowly circling ever since. Many who walk the Vatican grounds sense something unusual without knowing why. They feel a quiet heaviness underfoot, as though the stone pavements are resting atop something immense and ancient. Some describe it as standing above an ocean whose waves have been frozen in time. Others feel the strange intuition that beneath the polished floors, stories older than scripture breathe in the dark. These sensations are not imagination. They are echoes, faint vibrations of a memory too immense to vanish entirely. Archivists who have worked in the oldest chambers for decades speak of a peculiar sensation that comes and goes, a feeling that something is listening. They do not mean spirits or ghosts. They mean memory itself. Memory so concentrated, so layered, that it produces a presence all its own. One archivist, now retired, once said that the deepest rooms feel like standing in the shadow of a mountain you cannot see. He never explained the phrase, but those who have entered the same rooms understand exactly what he meant. Among the manuscripts kept there is a leather-bound codex from the 8th century, written in a script influenced by both Latin and Greek. Its pages contain an account of a bishop who traveled through the deserts of the Levant. He writes of encountering a group of nomads who honored those who stood between heaven and earth. The nomads told him their ancestors had witnessed beings descending in spirals of light. They had eyes that shimmered like embers and voices that caused the sand to tremble. The nomads insisted these beings were neither gods nor angels, but travelers whose home was far beyond the wanderings of the moon. The bishop, perplexed and somewhat unsettled, recorded the story without judgment, wondered if these were visions or perhaps illusions created by heat and exhaustion. But he also noted that the nomads carried knowledge of the constellations far beyond what their simple lifestyle should have allowed. They could identify stars invisible to the naked eye under normal conditions. They understood the cycles of celestial events with uncanny accuracy. The bishop wrote that their knowledge felt inherited rather than learned. This line is underlined in the manuscript, likely by a later scholar who recognized its significance. In a drawer beside the codex lies a stone carving obtained from an archaeological expedition in the early 1800s. The carving depicts two tall figures standing beside a circular object. The figures' proportions are elongated, their eyes large and almond-shaped. They hold long rods with spherical ends, pointed toward the object between them. Behind the figures are patterns that resemble rays of light or energy. The carving's origin is uncertain. Some believe it came from a forgotten temple. Others think it was part of a ritual monument. But regardless of its origin, its imagery is unmistakable. It mirrors the depictions found in Sumerian, Egyptian, and Mesoamerican sites. Different continents, different eras, same presence. This carving was studied extensively when it first arrived in Rome. Scholars compared it to ancient reliefs, noting the similarities in posture, proportions, and symbolism. They debated whether the carving represented deities, ancestors, or something else entirely. Eventually, the carving was quietly stored, not dismissed, not ignored, simply placed where its implications would cause no disturbance. The Vatican did not need to explain it. Its meaning was already inscribed in too many cultures to deny. Another artifact in the same room is a fragment of parchment written in a language not fully understood. The script resembles early Aramaic, but contains symbols found nowhere else. The translation, incomplete as it is, describes a celestial event observed by an ancient priest. He writes of a fire that moved contrary to all fires, drifting across the sky in silence. The priest describes the object as shaped like an egg of silver, gliding with intention. He writes that his people fell to their knees in fear, believing the gods were descending. But he alone remained standing, watching as the object settled upon a distant hill. He claims that 3 figures emerged from the light, their forms unclear but tall, radiant, and clothed in garments that reflected the sky. The manuscript ends abruptly, torn at the edges. The remaining fragments suggest the priest approached the hill, though the rest of his account has been lost. Scholars are unsure whether the missing sections were destroyed by time or removed deliberately. The Vatican does not comment on incomplete texts. It only preserves them. In another chamber lies a series of letters written by a 16th century Jesuit who spent years living among tribes in the Andes. The tribes told him of beings they called the Sky Brothers, who descended during times of famine and drought. These beings, according to the tribes, taught them how to build terraces, irrigate mountainsides, and cultivate crops that could survive harsh climates. The Jesuit initially dismissed these tales as mythology, but he found carvings in high-altitude temples depicting figures with elongated skulls, holding objects that resembled tools rather than weapons. The carvings were ancient, far older than the tribe itself. When he asked about their origin, the tribe simply said, "Those symbols were here before we were." The Jesuit's letters express a growing sense of confusion. He writes that the tribe possessed astronomical knowledge that no isolated civilization should have had. They could track solstices with remarkable accuracy. They aligned their temples with star movements unknown to Europeans at the time. He wondered privately whether these abilities were remnants of a forgotten era, one where humanity was guided by beings who understood the heavens far better than the people they taught. The Vatican archived his letters. They remain in pristine condition, preserved alongside similar accounts from other missionaries who encountered tribes with inexplicable knowledge. Across continents and centuries, the pattern repeats. Isolated civilizations possessing advanced astronomical understanding without any clear line of transmission. The archives hold too many such examples for coincidence to remain a satisfying explanation. There are also documents describing encounters in medieval Europe that defy simple interpretation. One such account, written by a monk in the 10th century, describes a luminous sphere descending into a field near his monastery. The sphere hovered above the ground, radiating a soft blue light. The monk and 2 companions approached it cautiously. They felt a warmth emanating from the object, though the night air was cold. The monk writes that the sphere emitted no sound, yet the grass beneath it swayed as though touched by a gentle wind. When the sphere rose into the sky and vanished, the monks found a circle of scorched earth where it had hovered. They preserved samples of the soil in ceramic jars, believing it had been blessed or touched by divine presence. Those jars still exist in the archives. Modern scholars who examined the soil in the early 20th century noted unusual mineral patterns. The samples were stored again, their analysis left incomplete. The Vatican does not draw conclusions, it only keeps the evidence. Even the Church's early saints recorded encounters that bear uncanny resemblance to ancient visitation narratives. Saint Columba wrote of a shining visitor who appeared on a stormy night, speaking words that resonated through the walls of his cell. Saint Hubert described a being whose body glowed with a light, not of flame, but of the stars. Saint Cyril wrote of an engine of fire descending into a valley, leaving trees bent and scorched in its wake. These accounts are often interpreted as visions or metaphors, but the details, radiance, heat, silence, craft-like structure, suggest something else. The Church never dismissed these accounts. It canonized the saints, celebrated their experiences, and interpreted their encounters through a theological lens. But the archives preserve the original writings, unedited and unfiltered. And those writings, when read with modern understanding, paint a picture strikingly familiar to ancient stories of visitors descending from the heavens. There is a growing sense among some scholars that the visitors did not come to instruct civilizations alone. They came to prepare humanity for something, an awareness, a recognition, a readiness. They guided our ancestors through crises, taught them skills they were not yet capable of developing independently, and left behind knowledge encoded in symbols, stars, and stories. They did not stay, they did not conquer, they did not rule. They simply passed through, leaving humanity changed but not dependent. This subtlety is what makes their presence so difficult to reconcile with modern frameworks. They behaved neither as conquerors nor as saviors. They behaved as observers with purpose. They intervened when necessary, remained distant when not, and departed when their work was complete. The Vatican understands this pattern. It has observed it across cultures, across texts, across time. As the world advances, the ancient stories no longer feel incompatible with reality. Humanity now looks to the sky not with fear, but with curiosity. Spacecraft drift beyond our planet. Telescopes peer into the past. Scientists speak openly of the possibility of life among the stars. The old memory, buried beneath religion, myth, and fear, rises slowly to the surface. And the Vatican, custodian of that memory, remains silent, not to hide the truth, but to let humanity rediscover it on its own terms. One day, the silence will not be needed. The archives will open naturally when the world is ready, when the distance between myth and science has dissolved enough for the ancient story to feel familiar. Humanity will look at the sky and understand what its ancestors saw, that the universe is alive, that we are not alone, and that beings older than our civilizations once walked beside us. Until then, the Vatican keeps watch. It protects the fragile pieces of the oldest memory we possess. It waits, patient as stone, for the day when the world finally looks upward and recognizes the faces in its oldest stories. The visitors were here. They taught us. They left. They may one day return. And the truth of who they were has been waiting in the dark all along. There are stories buried so deeply in human consciousness that they surface only in dreams, myths, and quiet intuitions. Stories older than civilization, older than language, older than the world humanity believes it understands. The Vatican knows these stories intimately, not because it created them, but because it inherited their remnants, shards scattered through time like fragments of a shattered mirror. When pieced together, these fragments reveal a reflection humanity has spent centuries avoiding. A reflection not of gods, but of visitors. Visitors whose presence shaped the earliest chapters of human development in ways modern minds still struggle to grasp. In one of the oldest cabinets of the archives lies a manuscript written in the early centuries of the Church. Its author was a scholar tasked with studying ancient traditions that predated Christianity. He copied Sumerian legends, Egyptian funerary texts, and fragments of Proto-Semitic traditions. His notes reveal a recurring fascination with beings described as radiant, tall, and wise, beings who descended from the sky, carrying knowledge that transformed primitive tribes into organized societies. What troubled the scholar was not the existence of these stories, but their consistency. Civilizations separated by oceans, mountains, and vast stretches of uncharted land describe the same forms, the same descent, the same teachings. His notes show a reluctant acknowledgement of a possibility he could not write openly, that these beings might have been real. That myth was memory softened by time. He writes, in a line preserved with remarkable clarity, "These are not tales of gods, but of travelers." The Vatican never suppressed his manuscript. It simply placed it among many others, recognizing its importance, but withholding it from public interpretation. The Church understood that revealing such conclusions too early would fracture more than it would illuminate. Faith needed stability. Civilizations needed anchors. Humanity needed time. Deeper in the archives, another text offers an even more startling glimpse into ancient memory. It is a clay tablet, partially broken, whose translation reveals a dialogue between two beings, one earthly, one celestial. The celestial figure speaks of the cycles of stars, the burdens of guardianship, and the teaching of those who rise from dust. The earthly figure asks why humans were chosen for this guidance. The response given is poignant, because they reach upward. That line, simple as it is, appears in several ancient languages across different cultures. It is carved into temple stones, written into hymns, woven into oral traditions. The Vatican has traced the phrase's variations across continents. It always carries the same meaning. Humanity is guided because it seeks, because it questions, because it looks to the heavens and wonders. There are also accounts written by early astronomer priests, individuals who observed the sky with both scientific curiosity and spiritual awe. Some described movements of objects that did not follow the laws of known stars or planets. They recorded sudden bursts of light, arcs of motion, and silent luminous forms drifting against the backdrop of constellations. They wrote of wandering fires and traveling suns, unsure of what they witnessed. The Church preserved their journals because they represented a kind of innocence, observations unclouded by doctrine or fear. One priest wrote that a luminous object descended toward the horizon, hesitated, then ascended vertically with impossible speed. He noted that the object made no sound and emitted a glow unlike fire. He ended his entry with a humble admission: "I do not know what my eyes have seen, but I felt watched by something ancient." The Vatican archived his journal alongside others like it, recognizing that his account echoed the experiences of shepherds, sailors, and travelers across ages. These sightings, though unexplained, were too consistent to dismiss. Even more curious are the accounts from medieval explorers who ventured into the far northern regions of Europe. They encountered tribes who claimed their ancestors were visited by the skywalkers, beings who descended on nights when the air itself shimmered. These beings taught them how to track seasons by observing the aurora, how to understand the migration patterns of animals, and how to store food for long winters. The explorers recorded these stories in letters sent back to Europe. The Vatican collected these letters, recognizing in them the same pattern found across the ancient world, guidance delivered in moments of need. The Vatican's interest was not in the mythic content of these stories, but in the quiet threads binding them together. A shared memory across humanity, a memory older than religion. A memory that, when viewed in its entirety, pointed toward a presence that had walked the earth long before written history. In a dim corner of the archives rests a set of stone tablets discovered in a ruined temple in Anatolia. The tablets display carvings of tall, elongated figures standing beside smaller humans. The tall figures hold spherical objects emitting rays of light. The humans appear to be receiving something, perhaps knowledge, perhaps tools. Around the scene are symbols depicting stars and strange geometric patterns. The tablets are remarkably similar to carvings found in South America, though separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Scholars who examined the tablets privately noted that the symbols resemble astronomical diagrams. The rays emanating from the spheres appear to correspond to star clusters visible from the region at the time the tablets were carved. But the tablets are older than the earliest known astronomical records. The Church did not comment. It simply protected the tablets from degradation, understanding that their significance would one day become clear. Another artifact lies in a velvet-lined drawer, a metal fragment discovered in an ancient burial site. The metal is unlike any known alloy, resistant to corrosion, retaining a faint shine despite its age. The fragment bears marks that resemble writing, but the script is unknown. It has been studied, measured, and quietly catalogued. It is not displayed, not because it would challenge doctrine, but because it would raise questions archaeology is not yet equipped to answer. Archivists who have seen the fragment up close say it feels lighter than it should, as though the material is not entirely bound to the density of the physical world. Some describe a faint hum when the fragment is held near the ear. Others dismiss this as imagination. But the fragment remains in storage, its origins unresolved. The Church's understanding of the ancient visitors is not theological in the traditional sense. It is historical, anthropological, observational. The archives do not claim these beings were divine. They do not claim they were angels. They simply record what humanity witnessed. Luminous figures descending from the sky, imparting knowledge, guiding civilizations, and departing once their work was done. The Vatican's silence is not suppression. It is stewardship, a measured effort to preserve truths until humanity is strong enough to understand them without fear, without fracturing its identity, without collapsing the structures that holds civilization together. There is a belief among some within the Church that humanity is approaching that moment, not because of faith, but because of knowledge. Science has expanded human understanding of the universe in ways unimaginable centuries ago. Telescopes peer into galaxies. Spacecraft wander beyond our solar system. The question of life beyond Earth is no longer heretical. It is scientific curiosity. The line between the possible and the probable grows thinner with each passing year. In that changing landscape, the ancient stories preserved in the archives begin to feel less like myth and more like fragmented history. The visitors described in Sumerian tablets, Egyptian carvings, Indian hymns, and tribal legends share too many similarities to be dismissed as invention. They represent a chapter of human experience the modern world has forgotten. The Vatican has been waiting for the world to remember. One night, perhaps sooner than expected, humanity will look at the sky and feel something familiar. A recognition, a stirring in the oldest part of the mind, a quiet knowing that the stars have always held more than light. They have held presence. When that moment arrives, the archives will open naturally, not because the Church decides it, but because the world will already understand. The memory of the visitors will return, not as myth, not as fear, but as a long-forgotten truth awakening. And humanity will finally see the sky, not as a distant realm, but as the place our earliest teachers once came from. There are certain passages in the archives so old that their ink has faded into shades of brown indistinguishable from the parchment beneath. Scholars read them under magnifying lenses, tracing the faint strokes with gloved hands, their eyes adjusting slowly to the ancient rhythms of a language untouched for centuries. These passages do not announce revelations, they whisper. They describe moments when the boundary between heaven and earth thinned, when early humans stood face to face with beings they could neither classify nor comprehend. One such passage, written in a script older than classical Hebrew, describes a night when a group of desert wanderers witnessed the heavens opening like a door of flame. The writer claims a structure descended, silent, luminous, geometric in shape. From within emerged three figures, wrapped in a radiance that rippled across the sand like heat. The wanderers believed they were in the presence of celestial beings, yet the figures spoke in tones too precise, too clear, too measured to resemble divine thunder. Their instructions were practical: where to settle, how to find water, how to identify the stars that marked the passing seasons. The writer does not describe worship, he describes learning. This distinction matters. Worship belongs to gods. Learning belongs to teachers. The Vatican has always understood the difference. In another manuscript, written centuries later by a historian living in Alexandria, there is mention of visitors whose garments shone brighter than gold. The historian struggles to reconcile their presence with his understanding of the world. He does not call them gods. He does not call them angels. He calls them those from the far places. He writes that they moved with grace, but not with the weightlessness of spirits. Their steps pressed into the earth. Their shadows fell across the ground. They left footprints that filled with dust in the days following their departure. He records that these visitors taught the ancestors how to build structures aligned perfectly with the solstices and equinoxes. They taught them how to calculate the length of the year, how to measure angles and distances, how to carve massive stones so precisely that not even a blade of grass could fit between them. These achievements, found on every continent, suggest a level of mathematical understanding far beyond what early humans should have developed independently. The Vatican studied these manuscripts not to undermine faith, but to understand the depth of human history. It recognized that the divine and the ancient visitors might not be separate at all, that the universe could allow for both spiritual transcendence and physical beings who travel between stars. Another collection of documents, preserved from an early Christian monastery in Ethiopia, tells of beings who descended on nights when the sky glowed faintly with white fire. The monks who recorded these stories believed the visitors were messengers sent to guide humanity. They wrote of tall figures wearing garments that shimmered like woven silver. These visitors taught early communities how to create written languages, how to build tools from metal, and how to treat wounds using plants found in the mountains. What stands out in these Ethiopian texts is a phrase repeated several times. They came not to rule, but to remind. Scholars have debated the meaning of this line. What did the visitors remind humanity of? Some argue the phrase refers to moral teachings. Others believe it refers to forgotten origins, an ancient connection between earth and sky that humanity had once known instinctively. In the archives, near these Ethiopian manuscripts, lies a series of scrolls from a forgotten sect of early mystics. These mystics believed that human souls originated among the stars, that life on Earth was a temporary journey. They claimed that certain beings visited the Earth not to punish or test humanity, but to help humanity remember its cosmic heritage. Their teachings were never adopted by mainstream Christianity, but the Vatican preserved their writings because they offered insight into the spiritual imagination of early believers. These mystics described the visitors with remarkable clarity. They spoke of beings who traveled between worlds using a whirling light that moved in silence. They described vehicles that hovered above fields without disturbing the grass. They wrote that these beings communicated through thoughts rather than speech, sending messages that entered the mind like gentle waves. The Vatican has never publicly endorsed these descriptions. It simply keeps them safe, recognizing that truth often reveals itself slowly, in layers. Even more curious is a parchment discovered in a ruined chapel centuries ago. The parchment contains a diagram, an intricate circle with symbols representing constellations. Around the circle are drawings of elongated figures pointing to specific stars. The parchment appears to be a kind of star map, though its purpose is unclear. Some scholars believe it was an attempt to record the origins of the visitors. Others think it was a guide for understanding celestial cycles. The Vatican's astronomers studied the map and noted something striking. The stars marked in the diagram correspond to star systems visible today, but the arrangement is slightly different, as though the map reflects the sky from a vantage point far older than the parchment itself. This anomaly has never been explained. Elsewhere in the archives lies a manuscript written by a monk who traveled to the islands of the Mediterranean during the early Middle Ages. He describes an encounter with a group of fishermen who insisted their ancestors had once seen a ship of light descend onto the shore. The ship emitted no sound, and from within emerged beings dressed in robes of shining fabric. The fishermen believed these beings taught their ancestors the art of navigation, explaining the stars and currents with precision. The monk wrote that the fishermen possessed knowledge of the sea far beyond any other coastal community. They could predict storms days in advance. They knew how to navigate without stars, using subtle signs in the water and wind. The monk questioned how such a small, isolated community could develop such skills. The Vatican questioned it too, quietly, carefully, without drawing conclusions. In a locked drawer nearby are the fragmented remains of a letter written by an early church philosopher who pondered the nature of angels. He wrote that angels were not purely spiritual beings, but intermediaries, beings capable of moving between physical realms and spiritual dimensions. He suggested that some ancient encounters described in Scripture may have involved beings with physical bodies and advanced knowledge. The Church never adopted his theory into doctrine, but it preserved his writings because they offered a bridge between ancient testimony and modern understanding. One of the most enigmatic items in the archives is a bound manuscript from the Renaissance. Its author was a polymath, part scientist, part theologian, part philosopher, who spent years studying ancient religions. He believed that the gods of antiquity were misunderstood visitors from the heavens. His manuscript includes drawings of beings with elongated skulls, wearing outfits that resemble suits rather than robes. He drew what he called heavenly vessels, metallic shapes capable of flight. He wrote that humanity had forgotten the true nature of these beings, transforming them into gods or angels. His manuscript was never published, not because the Church feared it, but because Europe at the time was not prepared to consider such ideas. The Vatican preserved it anyway, storing it among writings that hint at the same conclusion. As the centuries passed, the Church encountered more and more accounts that echoed the same story. Reports of luminous objects appearing in the sky, descriptions of beings who taught early communities skills that transformed their ability to survive, symbols carved into stone that resembled star maps, legends of watchers, sky fathers, and radiant teachers. And beneath all these accounts lies a shared memory that seems impossible to dismiss. Humanity once walked with visitors who came from beyond the earth. The Vatican's silence is not a denial. It is a recognition that truth unfolds gradually, becoming visible only when humanity is ready. The archives hold evidence of encounters that shaped human development long before religion was codified. These encounters do not diminish faith, they enrich it. The Church understands that creation is expansive, that the divine can work through many means, that the universe is vast enough to hold both spiritual and physical mysteries, and that the beings ancient civilizations called gods or angels may have been neither. They may have been travelers, curious, ancient, and compassionate. Humanity stands now at the threshold of rediscovery. Telescopes reveal planets around distant stars. Scientists speak openly about the possibility of extraterrestrial life. Philosophers consider the implications of consciousness beyond Earth. The world grows more prepared each decade for a truth preserved in silence for millennia. One day, the memory will return fully. Humanity will look at the stars and recognize familiar patterns. Ancient carvings will be understood not as myth, but as history. The visitors will no longer be figures of legend, but members of a cosmic community humanity is finally prepared to join. And when that moment comes, the Vatican's archives will not shatter the world. They will simply confirm what humanity already feels in its bones. We were never alone. We were taught. We were guided. We were watched over. And the visitors, whatever name we give them, may still be closer than we imagine. In the very oldest corner of the archives, a chamber so far beneath the Vatican that even many senior scholars do not know it exists, there is a shelf of manuscripts that appear out of place. They are not written on parchment or papyrus. They are carved on thin sheets of something that resembles bark, but the material is harder, smoother, unnaturally preserved. Some scholars believe the material is an ancient form of treated wood. Others quietly argue that it is something else, something the ancient world should not have been able to produce. The manuscripts are written in a language that has resisted complete translation for centuries. The script flows in spirals rather than lines, looping around itself like water, following the shape of a whirlpool. Only fragments have been deciphered, but those fragments alone are enough to unsettle even the most rational mind. One line reads, "They came from the place where the sun sleeps." Another, "Their eyes saw through the dark places between the stars." Another, the most haunting of all, "They shaped us with patience." The Vatican does not claim these lines refer to the Anunnaki or any other ancient visitors. It does not assign names, it simply preserves the manuscripts, because preservation is safer than interpretation. Among the manuscripts is a drawing, etched with a tool that left grooves finer than any metal stylus of the era could create. The drawing depicts a figure standing over a group of early humans. The figure is tall, slender, and cloaked in radiance. Its arms are long and graceful, and its face is obscured by some form of mask or helmet. The humans kneel before it, not in worship, but in what looks like attentive learning. One holds a stone tool, another holds a tablet, a third holds nothing at all, as if receiving something unseen. On a far wall of the chamber, protected behind layers of glass, is a large slab of stone discovered in the 1800s. The slab bears carvings of star patterns that match constellations visible thousands of years ago, but the alignment on the slab is subtly different from the sky recorded in ancient calendars. It resembles the sky seen from a slightly different angle, as though carved by someone who observed the stars from a position not strictly bound to Earth. The Vatican's astronomers studied the slab quietly. They noted that the configuration of stars matches the sky as it would appear if viewed from a location slightly above Earth's orbit. This observation is written in a margin note, unsigned, almost embarrassed. No one wanted to state the implication outright, but the implication remains. The carver of the slab saw the sky from a vantage point early humans could not reach. Beside the slab lies a small chest, discovered during renovations in the 17th century. Inside it are fragments of an early Christian commentary that discusses Genesis with surprising frankness. The anonymous writer questions whether the sons of God, mentioned in ancient texts, were spiritual beings or physical ones. He notes that their descriptions align more closely with the luminous visitors described in pre-Abrahamic traditions. He suggests, cautiously, that the beings who descended to interact with early humans may have been part of a long-standing relationship between Earth and those from the heavens. He writes a sentence later crossed out with ink so heavy it soaked the parchment. They were not angels. They were our elder kin. The Vatican did not destroy the manuscript. It simply stored it away. Farther into the chamber is a stone tablet from an unknown culture. The symbols etched upon it bear resemblance to neither cuneiform nor hieroglyphics. They form patterns that look mathematical, geometric, precise. When modern researchers examined the tablet with 20th century tools, they found that some of the etched shapes correspond to ratios used in advanced astronomy, ratios describing planetary orbits, lunar cycles, and the precession of equinoxes. The culture that carved the tablet should not have known these ratios. They should not have measured time with such precision, and yet, the ratios are accurate to several decimal places. The implication is not that early humans discovered these values independently. The implication is that someone taught them. There is also a manuscript from the late Roman period describing a strange occurrence in the hills outside the city. A group of shepherds saw a radiant figure walking along a ridge at twilight. They believed it was an angel. But when the figure approached, they noticed details that did not align with scripture. It emitted a faint hum. Its radiance did not flicker like fire, and its form seemed encased in something metallic rather than ethereal. The figure raised one arm and emitted a beam of light that illuminated the ground. The shepherds fled. The figure watched them leave, then ascended into the sky on a column of illumination. The church collected this account because it resembled earlier records too closely to ignore. During the Renaissance, a scholar discovered an ancient codex hidden behind the wall of a monastery. The codex contained stories from a desert tribe that believed the visitors came from a mountain of stars. The tribe described them as tall, peaceful, and deliberate in their movements. They taught early humans how to cultivate grain, write symbols, and build structures aligned with celestial events. The tribe claimed the visitors left when humans began fighting among themselves. They left silently, but promised to return when humanity was prepared to remember the stars. The codex ends with a striking line. "We were shaped by those who walk the night sky." This line is written again on the final page, as if the scribe wanted to ensure it would not be forgotten. The Vatican has compared this line to early Christian writings describing beings who walk among the stars and descend from the heavens in radiant form. The parallels are unmistakable. Different regions, different eras, same memory. Across the room from these manuscripts lies a set of ancient maps, drawn by a civilization whose identity remains unknown. The maps show coastlines thousands of years before they were accurately charted. They depict rivers long since dried and mountain ranges from perspectives that suggest aerial observation. Some historians claim the maps are imaginative works. Others quietly admit they cannot explain their accuracy. One map in particular shows the Nile River and its surrounding terrain with remarkable precision. But the angle of the map is slanted, as if drawn from a position high above the earth, as though the cartographer saw the land from the sky. The Vatican preserves the map because it knows the simplest explanation is also the most disruptive. The mapmaker viewed the earth from above, at a time when humanity had no means to do so. Another shelf holds scrolls from ancient India, describing the descent of sky chariots that glowed like hot metal. These chariots moved silently, without smoke or flame. The beings inside were described as radiant and tall, wearing garments that shone like polished stone. They taught kings the laws of justice, astronomy, and spiritual discipline. They left when their teachings were complete, returning to the abode of the stars. These descriptions match those in ancient Sumerian tablets, in Egyptian carvings, in Mayan glyphs, in Hopi legends, in Norse sagas. Radiant beings, sky vehicles, instructions, departure, never conquest, never tyranny, always teaching. The Vatican sees the pattern. It has seen it for centuries. The archives contain records from early scientists who observed strange objects in the sky, objects that moved with intelligence, objects that descended and ascended without sound, objects that hovered against the wind. These accounts were sent to Rome because the Church was regarded as the keeper of all things mysterious. The Church collected the accounts, studied them, and stored them alongside ancient manuscripts describing the same phenomena. In the modern era, as telescopes reveal new worlds and astrophysics expands humanity's understanding of the universe, the ancient accounts have begun to feel less like superstition and more like memory. Memory preserved in stone, memory written in clay, memory whispered in myths, memory guarded in silence. The Vatican's silence has never been rooted in fear. It is rooted in timing. Humanity was not ready centuries ago. It was not ready during the Renaissance. It was not ready in the Industrial Age. But today, the distance between myth and science has narrowed. The world is preparing itself, slowly, unintentionally, for a truth older than the world's religions. The visitors, whatever name they bore, whatever origin they claimed, were here. They taught humanity the first steps towards civilization. They left markings in the sky. They left knowledge encoded in symbols across continents. They left an ache in the human spirit, a longing for the stars. And they left behind the promise of return. The Vatican's archives are not a repository of forbidden knowledge. They are a library of humanity's oldest memory, a memory so profound that it reshapes everything when finally understood. One day, when humanity looks beyond fear and superstition, when it finally feels the ancient familiarity of the heavens, when it senses the presence that once walked among its ancestors, the silence will lift. The archives will open. The truth will reveal itself not as revelation, but as recognition. And humanity will remember that it was shaped not only by earth, but by those who came from the sky. There are truths that do not reveal themselves in bursts of revelation, but in the quiet accumulation of centuries. Truths that wait patiently at the edges of thought, gently guiding humanity with a presence so subtle that most mistake it for intuition. The Vatican has carried such truths in silence, not as secrets to withhold, but as memories to protect. Memories that would one day return when the world was calm enough to hear them. The oldest documents in the archives all suggest the same something. Something so simple and so vast that it feels like a whisper from a forgotten ancestor. Humanity has never truly been alone. Not in its beginnings, not in its darkest days, not in the long and winding nights when it looked to the sky and trembled with awe. The visitors who walked among early humans did not stay. Their purpose was never to rule or reshape the world in their image. They came as guides, as observers, as patient teachers who understood that growth requires distance. They left knowing that humanity must learn to stand on its own, must stumble, rise, and seek meaning without constant intervention. Their absence was not abandonment, it was trust. The Church saw this pattern long before the modern world could grasp it. It recognized that the ancient stories were not fantasies, but memories filtered through the language of their time. It understood that the divine and the cosmic were not enemies, but reflections of the same mystery, expressed in different ways by different ages. As centuries turned, the silence held. It was a silence not of denial, but of restraint. A silence that honored the fragile balance between belief and understanding. A silence that allowed humanity to grow naturally, without the upheaval that sudden truth brings. Now, as humanity reaches into space, sending its own crafted vessels into the vast dark, the ancient memory stirs. The old stories feel familiar again, like echoes from a childhood dream. Telescopes trace the paths of distant worlds. Instruments detect whispers of planets in the shadows of stars. Knowledge expands, stretching its hands toward the very places the visitors once called home. The Vatican's role in this moment is not to unveil anything, but to continue what it has always done. To safeguard the remnants of humanity's earliest encounters, to hold them gently until the world is ready to see the past, not as a set of isolated myths, but as a continuous thread stretching across the ages. In the deep archive chambers, the manuscripts rest quietly. Their ink has faded, their surfaces have cracked, but their message remains unbroken. They tell of beings who taught without conquering, who guided without commanding, beings who understood that humanity was capable of greatness long before humanity realized it. The archives do not ask for belief. They do not demand interpretation. They simply wait, patient as stone, constant as the stars, until humanity feels the truth rising naturally from within itself. One night, perhaps not so far from now, someone will look to the sky with a sense of recognition rather than wonder. They will feel that the stars are not distant, but familiar. They will understand that the stories told by ancient civilizations, preserved in temples and tablets and myths, were never fantasies. They were memories wrapped in metaphor, awaiting the day when metaphor is no longer needed. When that day arrives, humanity will not be afraid. It will not collapse under the weight of truth. It will rise into it. It will see that the visitors who once walked the earth were not exceptions to nature, but expressions of a universe far more alive than anyone imagined. And in that moment of quiet awakening, the Vatican's silence will end, not with drama, but with recognition. The truth held in its archives will align with the truth discovered in the stars. The past and the future will meet like old friends. Humanity will understand that it is part of a story older than its religions, older than its nations, older than the memory of its earliest ancestors. A story written not in one place, but across the cosmos. The visitors walked among us. They shaped our beginnings. They watched our rise. They left when we could walk alone. And the sky, patient as always, has kept the door open for their return. Until that day comes, the world drifts gently through the dark, guided by the same stars the visitors once followed, carrying the same questions humanity has whispered since the dawn of time, and slowly remembering what it has always known. We were never alone. We are still not alone. And the story continues, quietly, endlessly, beneath the eternal light of the heavens.